Hi, my name's Natasha, this is F Your History, and today we are going to be talking about a time when art imitated life. And of course, by that I mean the story of this woman and the plot of this film. Now, if you are anything like me, then you've suddenly got a lot of time on your hands for some reason. And I've been spending a great chunk of that time rewatching films that I loved as a child, including the 1997 classic animation Anastasia. Now, this is actually the first time that I was introduced to the story of the Romanovs, which is probably a good thing because I was 6 and the story of a family being murdered probably wouldn't have been great for my little mind. But I did love the film, and it is, of course, heavily fictionalized. I mean, for one thing, there's Rasputin's whole deal. And of course, the fact that there was no Bat Butler called Bartok, which is actually devastating, to be honest with you.
I'd give her a ha, then a hi-ya, and then a woo-ah, and I'd kick her, sir.
But the film does have at least one big grain of truth, and that is Anastasia herself. Not that she was Anastasia Romanov, no, she died in 1918, there really is no getting around that, but there really was a young woman that appeared out of nowhere one day who had amnesia and was thought to be Anastasia Romanov. In fact, she wasn't just thought to be, she was known to be Anastasia Romanov, and people really did take her in as the last survivor of the Romanov family. It is a wild story, and it has a lot of similarities to the film and a lot of things that are different, but actually kind of more insane than any Hollywood writer could possibly come up with. And so that is the story that we are going to be talking about today. But before we do, we should spend at least a couple of minutes talking about who the real Anastasia Romanov was. Anastasia was the daughter of Russian Tsar Nikolai II. She was the family's second youngest, with 3 older sisters, Olga, Tatiana and Maria, and 1 younger brother, Alexei, who was heir to their father's throne. Anastasia Romanov was the ultimate little sister. She was full of life, she was mischievous, and she was the family wildcard. Not to mention the fact that she actually gave us one of the world's first selfies. But although her selfie game was incredible, things weren't going so great in Russia. Throughout the early 1900s, Russia was one of the most impoverished countries in Europe. Years of famine and unrest, as well as endemic government corruption and just bad ruling on Nikolai II's part, led to 1917's February Revolution. Nikolai resigned, and following the Bolshevik uprising, Vladimir Lenin became leader. The Romanovs were now a threat to Lenin's power, and although they'd already been in prison, in spring 1918 they were secretly moved to a new location, ominously called the House of Special Purposes. Now, if you're thinking that doesn't sound like a great place, that's because it wasn't. But 17-year-old Anastasia tried to keep everyone's hopes alive. But it didn't last long. In the early hours of 17th of July 1918, the family and their closest servants were led into the cellar. There they were told that they were sentenced to death, and a firing squad immediately got to work. Tatiana, Maria and Anastasia were some of the last to die. Thinking that they were going to be exiled, the family had sewn precious jewels into their clothes, which now acted as a kind of bulletproof vest. However, when the dust was cleared, Anastasia and her whole family were dead. But where does the plot of the film come into this? Well, although news of the Romanovs' deaths have spread, there wasn't actually any bodies, so it was kind of free game for anyone to pop up and be like, haha, I am actually a surviving Romanov, there is no way to prove that I am not. And although a lot of these imposters did get a lot of publicity at the time, none of them really got enough credibility or traction to stick around that long. Until, in 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin, and everything changed. This mystery woman was taken to Daldorf Asylum. She didn't seem to know who she was, and she had no ID to give any answers, so she became known as Madame Unknown. Which is a great drag name, by the way, but back to the story. Madame Unknown wasn't completely unknown. There were some traits about her that really stuck out. For example, she spoke with a Russian accent, but couldn't actually speak Russian. She'd also come in with very hastily stitched up wounds and held herself with a regal grace and poise. One fellow patient decided that all of this combined must mean that she was a princess on the run, and the rumour mill started to churn, and this turned into she's one of the surviving Romanov princesses. And so all these Russian bigwigs started to turn up at the asylum to see if this was true. One of her visitors was the Dowager Empress's former guard, Nicholas von Schwab. He showed Madame Unknown a picture of the Dowager Empress and she said nothing. But then he left and she turned to the nurses and said, "That man has a picture of my grandmother." But then the Tsarina's ladies-in-waiting came and there was more proof. You see, one of the ladies-in-waiting looked at her and said, "Too short to be Tatiana." To which Madame Unknown responded, "I never said I was Tatiana." Everyone was now desperate to know who Madame Unknown really was, and so they came up with a foolproof idea. They presented her with a list of the names of every Romanov and asked her to cross out any name that wasn't hers. When the list came back, one name hadn't been crossed out, and just like that, Madame Unknown became Anastasia Romanov, or, as she now liked to be called, Anastasia Tchaikovsky. And people really did believe this. However, in 1927, it all looked like it was going to come crashing down because a Berlin newspaper published a story revealing Anastasia's true identity. Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who'd gone missing, and the person who was telling the story was Franziska's own brother. Franziska hadn't had an easy life. In 1916, her lover had died during World War I. A few years later, and still overcome with depression, she made a mistake at the factory she worked at, causing an explosion that supposedly killed a foreman in front of her. This led to a psychosis, and she was declared insane. However, just after this diagnosis, she went missing. And a few weeks later, in 1920, Madame Unknown was fished out of a canal in Berlin. Franziska's brother later swore in court that the woman claiming to be Anastasia was actually his sister. Franziska had always dreamed of being an actress, so maybe this was her way of living that out, or maybe she was just very ill and not getting any help. No matter what the truth was, Franziska's brother wasn't the only person calling time on this story. Over the years, many of those who'd known Anastasia Romanov personally came out and said there was no way this woman was her. And yet people still believed Anastasia's story. Why? Well, actually, it's kind of understandable. In 1917, the new Soviet government got rid of the Russian nobility hierarchy. This meant that a lot of the aristocracy fled to places like America and countries in Europe, going so far as to set up mini little pockets of the Russian aristocracy there. These were people that had lost everything that made them them. They were desperately clinging on to the past, so it makes total sense that when they were presented with someone saying, "Hi, I'm the survivor of the Romanov dynasty," they were like, "Yes, okay, we'll believe it. We want to believe anything at this point." And two of those people were the fantastically named Gleb and Tatiana Botkin. Their dad Eugene was the Tsar's personal physician. Gleb and Tatiana had actually grown up with the real Anastasia and had even briefly been imprisoned with her. Eugene was actually killed alongside the Romanovs in the House of Special Purposes, so it makes total sense that his kids, Gleb and Tatiana, desperately wanted someone to have survived that massacre. And they took Anastasia in, and they even overlooked her clear red flags that she wasn't who she said she was, putting her mood swings and her manic behaviour down to trauma and a royal disposition, apparently. In fact, Gleb and Tatiana even went so far as to write to survivors of the Romanov family, the people the real Anastasia was related to, and try to convince them that this Anastasia was their Anastasia. And then things really kicked up a gear. With the help of Gleb, in 1958, Anastasia, who now went by Anna Anderson just for added confusion, went to court to prove her identity, and in doing so gained the Romanov fortune. Anna didn't get the fortune, but she wasn't legally declared a fraud either. This meant that her supporters continued financing her lifestyle, but it also meant that she was now a bit of a freak show. She was known all over as either a princess or an imposter, and so tourists desperately tried to get at her house to get just a glimpse of her. This meant that Anna decided that she needed to escape, and so with the help of Gleb, she moved to America. There she married, ironically, a history professor called John Manahan and settled down in Charlottesville. John loved his new wife's royal lineage, and he even started calling himself the Tsar-in-waiting. And it was this totally normal behaviour that clearly cemented John and Anna as Charlottesville's resident eccentrics. In fact, one restaurant even advertised its wine, saying that after a couple of glasses, even you would think that you were a Russian princess. Still, the back and forth over if Anna really was Anastasia raged on. And this can't have been good for a woman who'd now been struggling with her mental health for decades without any help. By the end of her life, Anna actually ended up being committed to a psychiatric unit. Finally, she would be getting the help that she'd needed for so long. But this didn't happen. Her husband John actually broke her out of the unit and the pair went on the run, eventually being caught after a massive police chase when Anna surrendered herself and went back to the psychiatric unit. And she died there just 2 months later on 12th of February 1984. Just a few years later, in 1991, the bodies of Tsar Nikolai II, his wife and 3 of his daughters were discovered. Anna's DNA was tested against this, and now it was official. Anna Anderson, Anastasia Tchaikovsky, whatever you want to call her, she'd never been Anastasia Romanov. She'd always been Franziska Shankoska. However, to this day, people dispute this, saying that Anna Anderson really was Anastasia Romanov and that this whole thing is just some kind of giant cover-up. And if nothing else, the fantasy will still live on through films like 1997's Anastasia. So there you have it, the true story behind the film, the tale of perhaps history's greatest imposter, Anna Anderson / Anastasia Tchaikovsky / Anastasia Romanov. So what do you think? Do you think she knew all along and was just acting? Or do you think she was very, very ill? Or maybe you think she really is Anastasia Romanov? I would love to know your thoughts. For more history goodness, make sure that you click subscribe. We have new videos every single week and we also take requests. So if there's anything that you'd like to see talked about, just let me know. You can also visit our website, fearhistory.com, where you can find tons of articles on lots and lots of different historical topics. And you can also find even more history goodness on our social media, which is linked in the top. Until then, see ya!